This is hell. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is hell. Manufacturing dissent since 1996. This is not the media. This is hell, where every week we tell you the stories and views that scare the hell out of the rest of the news. I'm your bitter, blind, broke, gap-toothed radio show host, Chuck Mertz. Today, Mexico is on fire. Protests nationwide after the police disappeared 43 students. And for those of you listening in the U.S., as your indigestion from Thanksgiving slowly passes, let us remember the indigenous people, or instead actually talking to a living indigenous person who really does not want the Keystone XL pipeline. Speaking of Thanksgiving, we have a special question from hell producing this morning's show, and here to tell you what this week's holiday-related question from hell is Alexander Jerry. Alex, what is this week's question from hell?
This week's question from hell is, what was the worst thing you heard during Thanksgiving dinner?
And we are going to let this ride until next week, December 6th. The best reply will get a copy of a book that has made our list of books featured on This Is Hell in 2014 that you should give to that special someone in your life who you only see during the holidays and you really want to piss off. That said, our first book on this year's list, which is in no particular order, is Rick Perlstein's The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. The person who gives us the best reply to the question from hell, which is posted at our This Is Hell Facebook page, they will receive a copy of that book. All replies get read on the air during our December 6th show next week, with the winner being determined at the end of next week's live on the air broadcast. Alrighty then. Dozens of people victimized by police, leading to nationwide protests, and no, we're not talking about Ferguson, Missouri. Here to tell us about the disappearances that have set Mexico on fire is our irregular correspondent, Laura Carlson. She is a foreign policy in focus columnist and a policy analyst and director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy. She is based in Mexico City. She's a writer and editor of the Americas Updater, which can be found at cipamericas.org. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, Chuck.
So one of the things that was breaking last week was the announcement by President Obama about the immigration policy within Mexico. I started thinking about how that policy might relate to the 43 students that were disappeared in Mexico. Then I started thinking about maybe it's the trade policy, maybe it's the war on drugs policy. And as I sent you in an email, I'm not too sure which is more frightening. If our trade policy, our war on drugs policy, our immigration policy are combining to create the situation in Mexico, or at least contributing to it, or maybe they're not combining. Maybe they're all working in a vacuum and they don't realize what the outcome is. Maybe they're working in a vacuum because of domestic policies and domestic politics here in the United States. Is there an immigration policy, a trade policy, or any type of policy, a drug war policy that the U.S. can have that would have made the circumstances for the 43 students who were disappeared not to be as likely?
That's a complicated question.
I know. That's why I started with it.
But it's a very good question. Yes, there could be, because it's very clear that public policy, including U.S. public policy toward Mexico, is behind and is responsible, at least in part, for this terrible event, what happened to 43 students and 6 persons who were also killed the same night that the 43 students were disappeared. And it's also true that these policies go together, although they have apparent contradictions. They're generally a policy of regional integration that has to do with opening up Mexico to U.S. transnational interests and with controlling Mexico for U.S. security concerns that have to do more with U.S. national security than with the security of the people of either country, and certainly not with the security of Mexico itself, because as we know, since the United States promoted this drug war, excuse me, there have been about 100,000 people that have been killed in a sharp spike of violence, despite the fact that, supposedly it was supposed to do exactly the opposite. So when you see this in the framework of the United States, taking regional control of North America, opening it up to foreign investment, and then seeking to protect those foreign investments within Mexico, it begins to fall into place in a sense why these apparently contradictory policies are not so contradictory. And behind all of them, there's very, very powerful economic interest. The case of the drug war is probably the most directly related to what happened in Iguala, Guerrero on the night of September 26th, when local police, and as you say, it's worth repeating, police. We're not talking about a crime that was carried out by organized crime, but these were uniformed officers, opened fire on 3 busloads of students and ended up killing 3 of them and taking into custody 43 who have never been heard from since. Those are the 43 students that are now being sought after, being searched for all over Guerrero, and have caused huge demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Mexico City calling for their return.
So why do you think the protests happened this time? There have been plenty of massacres since 2010. There have been plenty of mass killings. There have been plenty of mass graves found this week. There was yet again a mass grave found of 11 bodies. They haven't determined yet if those are any of the students who had disappeared on September 26th. Why this time? Why is it different, seeing as how there have been larger mass killings in the last few years? What made this one so unique, so different?
Well, there were a couple of factors. One thing was that it was so blatant. The police were clearly involved in it, and the other thing was that this rural school, it's a teachers' college that's designed since the Revolution. These colleges were formed specifically to train rural teachers. So that the people that go to these colleges, in this case it was an all-male college, and the young men who go there are from mostly surrounding communities. They're peasant communities, they're indigenous communities, they're very poor communities, and they have a strong commitment to not only going and getting professional training so that they can have better life for themselves, but also to going back and creating better conditions for their communities. And they have very explicitly revolutionary ideals that they teach within these colleges, because they were formed specifically for that right after the Mexican Revolution, which is quite progressive revolution. If you look at the original Constitution and all, and they call for social equality, they call for reclaiming the rights of peasants and indigenous peoples, and that's been a thorn in the side of the government. And the government's been trying to eliminate these schools for quite a while now, especially since it began to take on this neoliberal economic model, which began to privatize, and of course most of these schools, the peasant farmers who worked there are working on social farms that were also created in the revolution. So there's been a real conflict, a political conflict between these neoliberal governments, and especially now Peña Nieto with his whole new package of structural reforms, including privatization of the oil industry, and these rural schools that have been also known, because of these ideals, to be a center for student activism. In fact, these students were going into Iguala to get buses to take the students to the protest for the October 2nd, anniversary of the massacre of students in Tlatelolco. So they're very involved in student protests, and many people believe, including the students and the parents, that there was a political motive behind the abduction of these students and the killing of others, due to the fact that the government is trying to eliminate these schools. They've been trying to defund them, and that they consider these students to be troublemakers.
That's exactly what I was thinking, that usually when you hear about students who are protesting something, they're usually seen as middle class, sometimes even jet-setting troublemakers, right? Kids who are rich, who are going to a wealthy school, who come from a privileged background. That's where we usually think of many of the Western, social movements starting when you think of university campuses. But here is a completely different situation. As you write, the roots of the protests predate the horror in Iguala. That's the disappearance of the 43 students, as well as the deaths of 6 others, and the Peña Nieto administration. They are, in a sense, the latest phase of the historic struggle between Mexico's student left and the federal government, one that has been brewing for years, if not decades, but this time the fury has moved out of the left-wing teachers' colleges in restive southern states and into the rest of the country. So is this a brewing class war? Is that what we're seeing within Mexico? Because my understanding is the disparity of wealth in Mexico is much greater than in the United States, and especially when you have this kind of education system that is embracing more left-wing ideas, and especially when they're doing it with poor people, I would imagine that this is the starting of a class war. Would you say that?
Yes, I think it is, and I think it's been going on for a while, but we're seeing it very clearly right now. And this is typical of Mexican politics. There'll be latent conflicts for years sometimes, and it will seem that society's just putting up with a lot of political trends that are hurting the majority of the people. And we'll be asking, how long can this go on? And then suddenly there'll be a single event that detonates a movement like this has here, which is really a movement that's not based on a single event, but based on an accumulation of factors that have been happening for a long time. So in this case, it's the inequality and the fact that there's been growth since NAFTA, since the North American Trade Agreement, in the number of poor people and the disparity, as you mentioned, between the rich and the poor, with the very obscenely rich, one of the richest men in the world, Carlos Slim, and then extremely poor people whose children go to bed hungry. And one of the things that's been interesting that's exacerbated these protests regarding the 43 disappeared students, too, is that a scandal broke out at the same time, or just about a month afterwards, that is now embroiling the country and has to do with the $7 million mansion that the president's family is living in. And it's actually in the name of a construction company that was hugely benefited by government contracts when he was both the governor of the state of Mexico and as president. So there's an investigation into that. It's bringing out a huge list of properties, multi-million-dollar properties of both the president and his wife. And there's a lot of accusations of conflict of interest that seem to be fairly clear, as well as just, again, this in-your-face disparity between the way that the president is living and his family and the way the majority of Mexicans live. So that comes out as social anger. And when you add to it the fact that most people or many people in the country can't live in situation that they consider safe for themselves and their families, especially in places like Guerrero or in other states throughout the country, then it's become an unsustainable situation. And there are massive cries for not just the resignation of the president, but kind of a whole shakeup in the political system.
But Peña Nieto, he did win the 2012 election, and the alternative to the PRI or the PAN, the Vicente Fox's party, which have been fighting the drug war, only got a third of the vote. So are those who side with reform, who side with the students, are those people still in the minority? Because one of the things that I've been reading about this protest is that it has turned into a protest against Peña Nieto. It isn't necessarily just about trying to find out what happened to these 43 students. This has solidified the opposition against Peña Nieto, something that couldn't even happen in the 2012 election when the alternative to either one of the two dominating parties only got a third of the votes. So it was still, an alternative was still in the minority. So how much has this turned into a protest against Peña Nieto more so than just asking about what's going on within the drug war?
Well, in terms of the numbers and measuring minorities and majorities, there's some things you have to take into account. First of all, in Mexican elections, Mexicans have very little experience voting in free elections, since the PRI was a one-party system essentially for over 70 years. And in Mexican elections, people still often don't vote the way we would think of a vote of conscience or even of political conviction. And this was particularly true of the 2012 elections, when it came out that there was massive vote buying on the part of the PRI. And that means that poor people who really don't consider the vote to be anything that's ever really made a difference in their lives were willing to receive these grocery store cards that the PRI was handing out for maybe $100 or something in return for the vote. And they had these systems of checking to make sure that the person actually followed through and voted for Peña Nieto after having received these cards and other types of economic benefits. So that's a big factor in terms of how he won that much of the vote. And I think it's probably more than what we usually consider people being convinced that he was the best political offer in the field at that time. There's also has been a real change, I think, and as I say, it was brewing before, and then it's been kind of catalyzed by this event, and that has to do with people realizing that Peña Nieto is not coming through for them in a lot of ways, and that he does represent this very narrow, wealthy class of people. And the privatization of the oil and gas industry in particular, of the state-owned company Pemex, is something that really triggered a lot of that too. The polls we do have show that the majority of people were against that. It was a symbol of national pride that the oil industry was nationalized in 1938 and that the foreign companies were kicked out. And so now to have them coming back in again at this point is really something that offends a lot of Mexicans. That kind of opposition had been growing based on those privatizations and based on some of the other structural reforms, including the education reform, which kind of ushered in this standardized evaluation, no child left behind, quantitative type way of looking at education that had led to many teachers protesting in the streets, and many especially poor rural communities like the ones this Teachers College would serve also protesting at that time. So it's been building up around these series of bold initiatives that the Peña Nieto administration has put forward.
So do you think this is more than not about the war on drugs, but more so about a war on education, more so about a war on the public trust and public utilities?
Well, I think it's both things. The way that the war on drugs comes in, and this is where it gets complicated, is that the war on drugs has never really been a war against drug cartels in Mexico or anywhere else you look at it. And we can tell that by the lack of results, and we can also tell that by what they're doing on the ground. And here in Mexico, what it means really is militarization. And a lot of that militarization has been used to protect investment and economic interests rather than to attack drug cartels. And in fact, we see that in many places that militarization, both police and military forces, is actually used to create partnerships between governing elite and drug cartel leaders. And this is certainly the case in Iguala. In Iguala, what we have is the war on drugs takes out a big name cartel leader, and that causes a splintering into smaller groups, and those smaller groups are far more dangerous, generally speaking, to the population than the larger cartels were. In this case, we had one by the name of Guerreros Unidos, which was virtually running the city, since the mayor and his wife, who was from the family that runs the drug cartel, were closely allied with the drug cartel. This created this situation where, in cahoots, they decided to kidnap and to launch an overall attack on the students themselves. And this kind of an incident is one we're seeing all over, and is a direct result of the policy of launching a war on drugs. Because before, they kind of carried out their business, and there wasn't that much affectation to the society itself. So the drug war does have a lot to do with it, but the drug war is part of that larger scheme of protecting economic interests. And, of course, the drug trade at some $38 billion a year is one of the major economic interests that's being protected.
You write that with frustration heightened by long-standing grievances with Peña Nieto, it's far from clear just how much worse things will get. Then you quote Cecilia, a teenager in Mexico City, saying, "We're here to demand justice, not just in the case of Ayotzinapa, but for all of Mexico. If there isn't justice, the country is going to explode." Do you believe that exploding is inevitable?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. Right now, the movement has really concentrated on finding the students and on being a nonviolent movement. And there's been property damage, which I think is somewhat different thing. But overall, with the exception of small groups in which there's some serious evidence that provocateurs could be involved, the movement has been peaceful, and that's their idea. They're not calling for anything that doesn't fall within that nonviolent framework. So it depends, I guess, on what you mean by explode. It's very clear that something has to change. Yesterday, Peña Nieto gave a speech presenting 10 points of a new security plan, and one of the things he said is that Mexico will never be the same after this event. So even he agrees that that's the case. Of course, from there on in, his security plan was really a rehashing of many of the same policies that have been stated before, as well as an intensification of many of his own policies that led to this problem, whereas the students, because this is really a youth-led movement, even though many sectors are involved, and the other protests are calling for a complete change in the political class. There's not much precedent for that kind of change. It's certainly new territory in terms of making these demands and how they'll be carried out. And it's really impossible, I think, to predict that or even create possible scenarios at this point. But what we are seeing is that many sectors are getting together on the grassroots level to push for change. They're getting together behind the demand for the resignation of the president, of course, for the presentation alive of the 43 students, and other than that, beginning to formulate some other kinds of demands. So this is important in itself, and means that there's been a big change on the grassroots level that one would think would lead to other kinds of changes. I don't think we're looking at least an immediate scenario of any kind of an armed uprising, and everyone hopes that that's certainly not the case.
When we announced on Facebook that you were going to be on our show, Laura, we got this from a listener by the name of Maya. She writes, "Thank you so much for reporting this, sir. I feel like there is hardly any coverage on this mess. So happy to see massive turnout in Mexico City. Lousy to see the police dressed as civilians and police brutality during this. I want to believe Mexico is finally waking up." Can Mexico wake up, in the words of Maya, without U.S. approval?
Well, that's what we're beginning to measure, what the limits are and what the reaction is likely to be. I think it's really significant that President Obama hasn't said anything publicly about this. There have been some State Department spokespeople, and that's really about it, who say this crime must be investigated and blah, 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 but nothing more than that, and certainly not pressure. So the United States is really, I'm sure, watching this closely. In fact, there have been several reports about private phone calls between Peña Nieto, There's been at least 3 private discussions between Obama and Peña Nieto, and we can only assume that that they're very worried about it, because the United States, 1 week before this happened, Peña Nieto was in the United States. He was in New York City. I was there then because the United Nations was having a meeting on the rights of indigenous people as well as the climate change march. And Peña Nieto was given an award for Statesman of the Year. He was heralded as the up-and-coming, modernizing president. He was the darling of the international press and of the U.S. government as well, because they have long wanted to see the oil and gas sectors opened up to U.S. companies. So he gets back and he faces the other Mexico that had this shining image abroad as emerging economy moving forward, and suddenly he's faced with the fact that, police in collusion with drug cartels are disappearing college students and murdering their own population. And that's really, for many people, the real Mexico here. In fact, it was hard to understand how it could have such a